This past Wednesday, the presidents of Iran, Russia, and Turkey met to discuss the latest situation in Syria. The talks, as the Russian President Vladimir Putin later told reporters, had opened a new stage in efforts to resolve the 7-year crisis in the country, a crisis that has taken multiple thousands of lives, displaced millions, destroyed a nation, and affected many other countries. Iran, Russia, and Turkey at the end of their meeting said that they would push hard to find a political solution to the crisis. The next step in the same direction would be to hold a Congress of a national dialogue, and all warring sides would be invited to participate in the Congress, which could take place within the next few days.
I can state with satisfaction that the presidents of Iran and Turkey welcomed the idea of convening a pan-Syrian forum, a Syrian National Dialogue Congress. It's been agreed to arrange for this most important event at the proper level and to ensure participation in it of the widest strata of Syrian society. The foreign ministers, special services, and defense ministers were instructed to work on a date and composition of the Congress to be held here in Sochi.
What we're seeing now is really the end of the war. The Russians have made it absolutely clear that this is of strategic importance to them as a superpower. And it's been interesting to see how the bases in Tarsus and elsewhere in Syria from the Russians have been protected by what the Russians have done. I think the Russians have been realised that if they were to be pushed out by a new regime, a new government in Syria, that this would completely unbalance the world power balance, and we would start to see massive encroachment of the West NATO forces in the Middle East, which would be a disaster.
Syrian opposition groups also held a meeting in the Saudi capital. At the same time, the meeting was taking place between Iran, Russia, and Turkey in Sochi. They called on the UN in their final statement to the end of their meeting to activate the political process for a dialogue between them and representatives of the Syrian government. But they insisted that the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad should play no role in any effort to bring peace to the country. It appears that the fate of President Assad is the main sticking point in efforts to resolve the Syrian crisis. President Assad himself has not indicated so far that he would step down. To the same degree, Russia has clearly called the future of Syria that it should be decided through elections and the formation of a new constitution.
Well, this demand that Assad leaves power, I'm afraid, is totally unrealistic and actually illegal under international law. It's for the Syrian people to decide who runs their country, not for the so-called rebels. And what we've been hearing and seeing is massive backing from outside for these rebels. For many of them are mercenaries, simply mercenaries. As the so-called opposition, the so-called rebels, sponsored by the West, lose the battle because what's happened is the Russian superpower has come in to back President Assad in fear of losing its really important bases in Syria. To keep that part of the world stable, we need a balance of power. The Russians need to be there, not just the American influence. And so the HNC has been falling apart because the war on the ground is falling apart. The West is starting to withdraw its support for these fanatics and for these mercenaries.
One important issue that still remains to be addressed over Syria is the fate of the country's Kurds. Strongly supported by the United States, they've already created a self-governed region in Syria's north. Turkey had already made it clear that it does not want to see a Kurdish state formed in its southern borders. This is also nothing that Iran desires to happen due to its own strategic considerations. The fate of the Kurds may have therefore already created a paradox of interests in efforts to resolve the Syrian crisis. This is specifically the case when considering that the Russians, together with the Americans, support them. Despite differences that exist among the parties involved in the Syrian crisis, it appears that efforts to resolve the crisis in the country are drawing to success closer than at any other time. It is still not clear how those efforts would proceed. The world specifically wants to know what would be the fate of President Assad, whether Syria would be disintegrated, and if the Kurds would form their own state in Syria's north.